thank you everyone for joining our session this morning. Really excited to have you with us this morning or whenever you're watching this recording. I'm Austin Hansel. I'm a product manager here at Toitū Envirocare, and I'm going to be your host for the panel discussion this morning. Today, we are here to discuss some of the key climate developments that we're seeing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as what's happening overseas. We're going to touch on things like the second emissions reduction plan, international climate regulations like the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, how New Zealand businesses are impacted by these developments. We're going to kick off this morning with some pre-arranged questions, and then we're going to open up the discussion for a live Q&A where you can ask the panelists your questions. Right. I'm going to introduce you now to each of our speakers. So we have Dr. Belinda Mathers, who's our Chief Science and Advisory Officer for Toitū Envirocare. Belinda leads our science and advisory function, so ensuring that we're keeping on top of scientific research, changes in best practice, changing market needs. Belinda has extensive experience in greenhouse gas emissions management and verification across many sectors, including verifying or certifying close to 1,000 emission inventories over the past 20 years. Also joined today by Dr. Sean Weaver. Sean is the founder and CEO of Ekos, a social purpose business delivering carbon management services and nature-based solutions. He's an international expert in market-based mechanisms for environmental and climate financing. He's a consultant to national and local governments, multilateral banks, international agencies, small, medium, and large businesses and corporations. He's a founding member of the Climate Forestry Association, a member of the New Zealand Institute of Forestry, and a founding member of the International Biodiversity Credits Alliance. He's a registered forestry consultant, has a PhD in forestry from the University of Canterbury, and is based in Christchurch. And also we have Jeff Smith, who's a director and GM at DETA, who are leading the decarbonization of New Zealand industry. Jeff consults to a wide range of industrial and commercial business on their carbon reduction goals and also supports engagements to provide technical support to government policy. Aside from his DETA role, Jeff leads an electric transport startup, eStroke, deploying cost-effective electric marine craft with a circular lens. Jeff has 3 young children and is driven to use his skills to give them the best future possible. Right. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into the discussion. Now, last time this group of us was together, we were discussing the Draft Emissions Reduction Plan 2, so ERP2, you might see it in the news. The final version has been released. We're going to do a quick fire. What's your biggest takeaway from the finalized ERP2 with a focus on the impact to New Zealand businesses? Belinda, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So for me, it wasn't an enormously ambitious plan. And there was quite a focus on things like carbon capture and storage, which aren't really well proven in the New Zealand context. So for me, that makes it even more important for businesses to focus on any opportunities they can find to reduce their emissions within their business and their value chain.
Nice. Awesome. All right, Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, I'd second that. So not a lot of change from the draft advice. I'm still focusing pretty heavily, as Belinda says, on CCUS, and I think it's interesting looking at what came out in Energy News this week. I think Todd Corporation have kind of come out and said if you want to do CCUS, you have to make it happen right now. Otherwise, we're not going to have enough time to get the impact we're looking to have because these projects have such a long lead time. And we're kind of running out of that fossil fuel gas piece anyway, which I'm sure we'll talk about throughout the conversation. I guess the other piece for me is that massive leverage and push onto agriculture, which I think is really, really important. But lots of the tech that'll enable us to get there is still not quite there. So there's still a lot of reliance on the stuff that isn't there, rather than the focus on the stuff that we know works right now and taking those steps, I guess, as quickly as we can.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Sean, how about you?
Yeah, I'm in broad alignment with Belinda and Jeff on the relatively pedestrian nature of the plan. Many years ago, there was a lot of ambition around how the economy could be transformed into a much more efficient one. And to do that, we needed to get a price of carbon into the economy so that it could have a genuine impact on investment decisions, so that the ordinary person in the street doesn't need to worry and fret about things so much, because the job of changing the structure of the economy is not their job. It's the job at a higher level, and that's the role essentially of government combined with institutional investors. Whereas still in this emission reduction plan, I don't see any significant change that would inspire institutional investors to divest from dirty and invest in clean. And until we do that, we're just going to have tinkering around the edges as we sail at speed towards icebergs and various other challenges. So that's my broad take on.
Nice. So already we've been hearing about things like technology, finance, policy, the kind of certainty that businesses want for planning. We're going to tap into all of those things more broadly, I think. Let's start with policy. So we know a few cool facts, like more than 80% of New Zealand exports by value are going to countries with some sort of ESG reporting requirements that are either already in force or that are proposed. And I think even if your business is not a direct exporter, you're probably part of an exporting value chain. So we see regulations like CBAM, so the Carbon Border Market Adjustment Mechanism. We see mandatory climate disclosures reshaping global trade, all over the map here. How are these policies influencing New Zealand businesses? What should New Zealand businesses do to try and stay ahead of these things? I think really what I'm wanting to ask you guys is, should businesses act now or should they be waiting for clear government direction?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll jump in first. Yeah, it's a really interesting space right now. And even over the last couple of weeks, we've seen some developments in the EU space with their what they call an omnibus of proposed changes to some of this legislation that they've been proposing. While some of those changes feel like they're delaying things or changing thresholds, that sort of stuff, they're not going away. So I think that would be a key message for me, is if you're seeing that things seem to be either watered down or delayed or not directly applying to you when you thought they might, it doesn't mean that it's not going to filter down to you. So it will come through, and I guess potentially the delay gives a little bit of breathing space to do things really well, but it doesn't mean things aren't going to need to happen in terms of being ready for these sorts of things that are coming in around transparency, disclosure, having really clear, substantiated data underlying any claims you're making, all that sort of stuff. So it's all coming, and it will come before we know it. So I guess don't slow down would be my key message.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And I think New Zealand is way behind when it comes to readiness for ESG and TNFD engagement with the world economy. We're relying very heavily on export earnings, and yet we're not getting our export earnings safeguarded for a future where access to markets and access to capital will increasingly depend on keeping up with the requirements of our demand side actors in the markets and various market gatekeepers. A good example of that would be in agriculture, where there's, I think, an assumption that we can just keep on doing what we're doing, but the requirements for agricultural imports in various parts of the world are going to impact back upstream to New Zealand farm landscapes, and we don't really have a sophisticated system of on-farm reporting and even tracking the various sustainability metrics of our agricultural and horticultural sectors. And that's a really important segment of the economy. And I think we need to step up that. And I think the government could play a really strong role, a stronger role than it's currently playing, in sending much stronger market signals that this is needed, but also to provide support and enabling infrastructure for businesses, and including and especially agriculture, to start to transition into this kind of readiness.
Yeah, I think the agriculture piece is interesting, and I think the government can play a bigger role. I'll touch on an example around the energy sector in a moment, but if you look at, say, what the market is doing agriculturally, we've got businesses like Nestle coming in, partnering with large organizations like Fonterra and financially incentivizing some of those changes. So business should move, they should move more quickly because you have access to more value streams. It's not just about security longer term. There is actually value to be had if you are a fast mover. Just in terms of that government alignment, I think what's really interesting at the moment in, say, the energy space is there's lots of work happening around new generation coming online. There is uncertainty in the market around things like the supply of, or the future supply of gas, and we've got a government saying we're open for business for gas, and we've got a market who's not investing in that space. And so I think we need more alignment with what the market is actually doing and what that is, what the market kind of needs to give certainty to the transition as well, because it is unhelpful, I think, for government to be so malaligned with what not only the market in New Zealand, but the rest of the world is currently doing.
Okay, so I'm hearing businesses should be acting now, but there's definitely a space for government to really help provide a little bit more clarity, provide some certainty, maybe help ease for a smoother transition. But really what we're seeing, writings on the wall, don't wait for it to hit you. Yeah? All right,
Use the opportunity now. Yeah.
I love that. Yes. All right, so right now, there's a little bit of economic uncertainty. You might see some businesses who are hesitating maybe to invest in sustainability. They're maybe focused on some really critical near-term fires even, right? But those who can act now will be gaining competitive advantages. You know, there's resource efficiencies, there's cost savings, there's risk management. Thinking about the different perspectives that you can each bring to this question, what are some practical steps that a New Zealand business can take this year in 2025 to be future-proofing themselves despite the economic downturn? Jeff, yeah?
Can I go first? I mean, building on the energy piece, I think if we go back in time a little bit to previous governments, and it doesn't matter if you're red or blue, it's kind of irrelevant at this particular point, but we as a country made some decisions back in 2015 that we were going to sign up and do these. It was 2015? I think it was 2015. Let's pretend it was. To sign up to these targets that we're pursuing. And as a result, we've made decisions around how we handle and how the government has engaged with the market. One of those key activities occurred in 2018 when we chose to ban offshore gas exploration, which felt like a pretty good thing at the time. Fast forward to now, we're in a position where actually gas supply is becoming more and more constrained. And so again, it's becoming a bit more, there is more awareness now across the general populace that we are running out of gas. And so although moving away and decarbonising has traditionally over the last few while been a nice thing to do, lots of the stuff and the decisions we have made are kind of coming home to roost now. And we need to make these actions because actually this is starting to become a business continuity piece. We've made decisions as a country to move down a track. We've stopped doing some things, we've started doing other things. And now it's at the point where business needs to make that move, because if they don't, it's actually a security of supply challenge, more so than a decarbonisation or sustainability challenge. And I think that's one of the things that I guess I've been reflecting on a little bit with the malalignment piece. Business can move now, needs to move now, or certainly have a plan to move, because we have two challenges in New Zealand right now. One is, yes, we're going to be having to move energy sources pretty quickly. The second part is we have a constrained labour force, and getting all this stuff done in a relatively short time frame is going to be quite challenging as well. So those who move more quickly will have more certainty and clarity about their future than others who wait.
100% agree, Jeff. And I think part of that, and maybe the next part or the first part for some businesses, really understanding where their risks lie. So, yes, you can start with understanding your footprint and having a plan to reduce it, and that's really important. But alongside that, building climate risks into general business planning and business management day to day, making sure that those things have been thought about will just help you to manage your business better and be thinking about, what are the risks around our energy supply that are kind of connected to climate, but not only. Do we have risks around our supply chains? And again, that's partly severe weather events, but it's also some of the other political things that are happening at the moment around tariffs and other things. So I think there's that sort of having a really broad view on business risk is super important right now. And it's something that businesses can do without spending a whole lot of money. It takes a bit of time, a bit of imagination, a bit of thinking, and those sorts of things. But yeah, that would be a great place to focus some attention.
Nice.
Yeah,
All right,
just to
Sean, yeah.
very briefly add to that, I think some of the really big challenges that are coming up for the next decade and more are going to be supply chain challenges. There's a changing world order happening at the moment that started to kick in even a few years ago that are likely to reshape the future of the movement of goods across globalization, the globalization framework, with many different countries starting to retract and move away from the globalization model. And that's very likely to impact on the cost of supply chain integration. Climate change management is part of that equation. And as Belinda said, it's about risk management and reading the tea leaves and understanding those trends. In the background to the climate change sort of mitigation challenges and the need to have ESG reporting and TNFD reporting, net zero carbon or something similar in order to maintain export markets. That's like a market access concern, irrespective of what the climate's going to do. So then we've also got what's the climate going to do to the economy in the coming decades. And there's an important piece of resilience building and planning in that space. And just one thing to add there, it's really important to not just invest in your own business. It's also every living system makes an investment in the broader system within which it exists. And that investment is in things like climate resilience and supporting communities to do climate resilience. And the voluntary actions, for example, that we can do in the near term can have a significant impact on building a more resilient nation. And if the government is not doing this fast enough, and because it's not illegal to look after the place, then an inspired private sector can get on and do it anyway. And I think that's really the big challenge. And I think this emission reduction plan, to me, signals that really there's a big, big role for the private sector to get on and just do this.
Mm. Okay, so take advantage of this, kind of maybe slightly slower moment to really lay the right foundation. So thinking about those risks, those opportunities in front of you, that might be around energy security, it might be around other resources in the natural world, your people, your energy, your supply chains. But there's a lot of things that you can be doing right now. Get that lay of the land so that you can make some really good informed choices for when we all pick back up again. When we pick back up again, let's think a little bit about money. So the role of money in how it can drive climate action in this space. So we all know, I think from a lot of different angles, you see financial mechanisms being used. You might use them to penalize, you might use them to reward climate action. So you see something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? Imposing some sort of carbon cost. You also see groups like Nestle, right? Incentivizing that lower emission farming. So we have both ends of that spectrum there and the role of money in helping us create the transition to the low carbon economy we want. So how do you guys think that businesses can be navigating these financial drivers, carrots and sticks, to be accelerating their own sustainability transition? Sean, do you want to start?
Sure. I think this, to me, also speaks to the role of government in helping to create the enabling conditions for a change in investment behavior. Fundamentally, that's really what I see as the core of this, is to enable those entities that are price sensitive to move their conduct. Though, for example, energy is price inelastic. And so people will tend to just pay more for their energy rather than reduce consumption when the price goes up. For that reason, it's difficult for organizations to shift in response to a price signal if they're in a price inelastic situation. But investors are price elastic. And so I think we need to take greater advantage of the price sensitivity of investors so that the investor community can move their money from dirty tech to clean tech, from dirty development to clean development. And that's very much a role of government to set those conditions, because we in the private sector can't do that to the banks and the institutional investor community, but the government can. And to me, that's the core. And I still don't see anything close to that happening. And I think it really does need to happen.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, Sean, because there's been some stuff in the media just lately where the government or parts of the government have kind of been indicating that actually the banks are moving on their own in that direction, and not being willing to invest in fossil fuel related things that they consider will become stranded assets. So it's really interesting. I agree that the government has a really important role to play there, but it seems to be happening, at least in that banking sector anyway, which is, the market doing its thing, right? So, and insurance is another interesting space where, insurance companies increasingly, and we saw it in the LA fires, are stepping back from high risk, coverage, and there are whole swathes of regions around the place that can no longer get insurance because of climate related risks. So yes, the government has a role to play, but I still think things are happening anyway, maybe not as fast as they would, but it's really interesting to see what's happening there. Jeff, I don't know whether you've got anything to add.
I'm not an expert in this space, but I guess I'm in Auckland. I was in a hotel this morning, and every time I'm in a hotel, I turn on the news because I don't like a quiet room. And I watched breakfast, and they had two ministers on. There was a national minister and a Labour minister, Labour person. They're here in Auckland for the infrastructure summit. And so I think actually, from a government perspective, I'd like to at least applaud the fact that they're going to market and trying to show some consistency. I think the issue in part with finance is that we've had such inconsistency between governments over the last few while. If you look, the last government we had was going to invest very, very heavily in renewables and go and play the like Onslow card. And whether or not you agree with that or not is beside the point. That's something that they wanted to do. And then we've cancelled that and swung very heavily back into fossil fuels. The reality in what the investment community needs is consistency. And so I was actually quite pleased today that we've had, and again, it's easy saying that on a couch on a TV show, but both representatives from both major parties saying we're aligned with the intent. And I think that's the intent that the financial community needs, which is we know what's going to be invested in over a 20-year period. Here are the projects or thereabouts. Let's get behind those. And I think that helps not only that community, that helps the engineering side of things, who are currently have no clarity on what's going to be happening in the future as well. It provides certainty to the economy, and so I think that's one of the things that I'm actually quite pleased to see coming out of government.
So that's kind of at a big picture, kind of massive level. Are there anything that you guys would add around a smaller kind of maybe business to business mechanism? Kind of some financial drivers that we're maybe seeing at that maybe smaller scale?
If businesses were to participate more strongly in the voluntary carbon market, they're going to drive an economy which funnels money into the kind of innovations that we're talking about. So the price signal itself from the emissions trading scheme isn't enough to drive the kind of behavior change that we need, because as I signaled, energy is price inelastic, and a carbon price hasn't really nudged that very much over the last 15, 20 years. Voluntary action can, through meeting your ESG and TNFD readiness requirements for doing business, whilst when you're doing that, making investments in your own emission reductions, moving things more quickly than you would otherwise do. And also, if you're going to make a compensatory claim, for example, with purchasing carbon credits, then your decision to purchase those in New Zealand, ideally, if you can, is going to help New Zealand build a more climate resilient future. And so if the voluntary carbon market were the source of demand for carbon credits in the voluntary supply side, which are coming from nature-based solutions that are building climate resilient landscapes, then you've got two sides of an equation that are both working essentially in synergy with each other. And so, yeah, a big take-home message is don't wait, get on with it.
Mm, nice. All right. We will be shifting to audience questions pretty soon, so please remember to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and drop your questions in there or upvote other people's questions as well. I want to shift a little bit now. Again, thinking a little bit big picture. So this year, we are 10 years into the Paris Agreement, and we're 5 years away from 2030. And 2030 is a really critical milestone for emissions reductions when we look at the kind of global carbon budgets and the targets that we have associated with limiting heating as close to 1.5 as we can. So, thinking about that for a New Zealand business, how can New Zealand businesses really be taking a lead in climate action, not only with meeting commitments, but really kind of helping to set a pace globally, really stepping into a New Zealand moment? Anyone want to dive in there?
I mean,
Mm,
I think when we came to the last webinar, I talked about the fact that we have a slightly different challenge to the rest of the world in achieving our low carbon future. We invested very heavily as a country in renewable energy over the 50s and 60s, and I guess that sort of time frame, and later on. But from an electricity perspective, the rest of the world is still catching up. And so if you look at what Australia is doing, what the States is doing, other countries haven't got that. And so their path to decarbonisation is completely different to ours. We have to do different things earlier than the rest of the world. And I still see a massive opportunity for us to support that growth, be it innovative agriculture, which obviously we're leveraging pretty heavily at the moment, although that doesn't exist today, or skill sets in industrial decarbonisation, which again, the rest of the world isn't really having to play just yet. Building that base to meet our own need and then exporting that to the world. I see a huge opportunity in that space. Because come the 2030s, when other large countries look to see what's worked around the world, we are still a base where people will look because we could have already addressed those things. So the opportunity for our market to service the world in this space still exists, but we have to jump on it pretty quickly.
Right. Linda or Sean, maybe thinking
I was
about,
just going to say 100% agree.
yeah.
New Zealand businesses, are known for being innovative, being agile. Our agriculture sector is doing some really interesting things. So I guess investing in some of the research that's going to enable that to speed up even more would be awesome. But yeah, Jeff pretty much covered it really well, I think.
I think also, looking at our role on the international stage, I think it's useful to look at that through a lens of comparative advantage. We're a country that can't do things as efficiently as other countries, but we can do some things more efficiently than other countries. And I think it's really valuable if we focus our attentions on what we're good at. One of the things that we are good at is producing food. And there's a high incentive to produce that food in a way that will keep markets open into the future. So there's a high incentive to get innovative in that space and not only use technological innovations, but also to use innovations that are already available. Like there's a very clever piece of technology in the room here, which is a light switch, and it's already been installed a long time ago, and I can turn it off. I can use the technology that's already here, and some of the technologies that are available to agriculture to do things like reducing herd sizes. So the technological approach to reducing emissions from a dairy herd could be trying to tamper with the genetics of cows and the biochemistry of digestion. But another approach, this word "and" is very useful, is also to look at regenerative agriculture and things like reducing herd sizes. And when that happens, you can have more grass per cow and more milk production per cow. And with a smaller number of animals on your land, maintain the same level of milk solids output at a lower cost, therefore driving up your efficiency and driving up your profitability. So this type of agriculture is sometimes called profit-focused farming because it is profit enhancing and it's available right now. So reducing herd sizes, and I've got farmer friends who've done this, and this is a good example of ways to reduce emissions right right at this moment. So I think, taking advantage of what we're particularly good at is something worth focusing on.
I think that's a nice kind of note there, taking advantage of what we're particularly good at, right? Like New Zealand Inc. There's a lot of things that over the years New Zealand has really been willing to step up and take a bold leadership role on, and this could be one of those spaces where New Zealand could be, leading. This is what a net zero economy looks like. This is, where this is what agriculture, this is what infrastructure, this is what energy security and beyond energy security even can look like in these spaces, as a way of kind of doing our fair share, but more, right? Does anyone want to add anything there around some of that, I guess, that transitional piece and around the kind of like equity, the justice role there around how New Zealand can do our fair share or more? I know.
Yeah. I mean, if New Zealand were to sink below the waves tomorrow, the rest of the world, well, it'll notice, but it won't be a big deal. And that sometimes gives New Zealanders a thought that, oh, well, let's just not bother. The problem with that is that we're going to lose access to markets because the rest of the world is bothering and we need to bother. Plus, there's a whole lot of resilience that we can build into our economy that we're otherwise not doing. And if we were to focus, so much of the conversation today has been on mitigation, like reducing emissions. We haven't talked so much about resilience and adaptation because the climate is changing. Even if we were to turn everything off now, there's still 50 to 100 years of climate warming that's coming down the pipe regardless. And that's going to have a significant impact on our ability to grow food. The biggest thing that tends to, or the thing that tends to kill civilizations is drought. And parts of New Zealand are going to suffer really significant water shortages. So this resilience piece is really important. It's also more nation building because we're not doing anything other than saying, look, as a community, we need to get ready for a challenge that's going to challenge all of us. And where farmers are on the front line of that, because when a drought happens, you don't tend to get IT consultants committing suicide in Wellington, but farmers do, because the impact of drought on the stress of farming is massive. And I think the country, I believe, would benefit from showing a greater concern for our farmers from a resilience perspective and build the narrative around that and build in the mitigation piece, the emission reductions piece on that backbone. Because then you're not shaming farmers for being emitters. You're working with farmers to build a more resilient future. And I think that can have a spill-on effect politically across the economy and across the political landscape, because we're still in somewhat a bit of a polarized debate around climate change, especially with respect to agriculture. And one way of undoing that is to stop seeing it in a polarized way and seeing it instead as a team effort.
It's a really good call out, Sean. And resilience is an interesting one because resilience is as much social as it is infrastructure. There's two really different elements to it, and you've got to think about both. So if we're thinking about the infrastructure side but not dealing with the societal needs, then it's just not going to work. So I think that's a really good point.
I think part of the leadership in this needs to be a cross-party agreement. Now, Jeff mentioned two political parties nodding and singing essentially from the same songbook. We absolutely need that. And to get that, we need the major parties to focus, I believe, a far greater level of attention on cross-party consensus on core elements, because this is what creates the kind of certainty that Jeff talked about before and that Belinda also mentioned. Because when all major political parties agree on a common foundation, that in itself is a really strong market signal. And it helps to give confidence to the private sector that actually, this stuff is heading in this direction. And then the arguments in politics can happen around the edges, but some of the core elements are still not in agreement. And I think that's a massively high priority between now and 2030.
All right. We're going to shift now. We're going to take some questions from our audience. everyone, please feel free to keep dropping your questions into the Q&A box. Please use the Q&A and feel free to upvote some others. We've got a lot of really diverse, interesting questions in here, and we're going to get through as many as we can. So we're going to kick it off with, we've got one for Jeff. So Jeff, the issues some of our clients have with electrifying heating systems in response to gas supply concerns or as part of decarbonization plans is infrastructure limitations. So their sites simply aren't set up for a large increase in electricity supply. And the costs to upgrade are significant. The timeframes to get the upgrades done are long. Have you experienced this? Is there anything that you could advise in this space?
I sure have, and I'm experiencing that on a daily basis. So I can empathize with that. But what I think we need to do here is think a little differently about the traditional grid and think more openly about what flexibility is going to look like in the future. So look, as an example, and again, some of those prices, I can give you a real life example now we're working on where a large industrial customer we're working with needs 8 megawatts of capacity, so probably bigger than most people on the call, but it's going to cost about $1 million for the 6 megawatt and 25 to get to 8, and that's because there are constraints elsewhere in the network. $25 million buys a lot, though, of alternative mechanisms and alternative thoughts. And so some of the stuff that we're currently exploring alongside our partners in the gentailer space are innovative battery solutions. So how can we make a battery work so we're actually helping the grid more broadly as well as helping ourselves, creating a revenue source? There's a Flex Forum currently investigating a lot of opportunity in that space. Or figuring out how our load can actually move and perhaps be more linked to when there's going to be lower cost pricing in the market or more capacity in the market. Up in Auckland up here, so the bus fleet, so down in Wynyard Quarter, Vector have got a contract in place with the bus fleet which allows them to have 2 megawatts between midnight and 5 a.m. say, when no one's around, and the rest of the time they can only have 200 kilowatts. So there is already innovation coming in the market. You need to have a more innovative conversation with those lines companies or with the gentailer, but we are seeing solutions coming through. It's just going to require a different approach. So I'm happy to chat offline about that, but that's 2 examples of how technology can meet the need in a non-traditional way.
I like that sense of like, let's think differently. Let's use this opportunity to really come up with a better, more resilient solution. We have a very popular question in this, and it's going to take us back to some of the stuff that we started with here. So thinking about the broad spectrum of global issues here, right? So we see the US rolling back some climate commitments. We see the EU scaling back their reporting rules. We see the CRD here delaying some Scope 3 assurance. Are we witnessing a broader retreat on climate action? If the big players are pulling back, why should New Zealand businesses stay the course? Beyond climate mitigation, where is the commercial benefit? Are there real cost savings, or is this just more time and effort in reporting with little return? And I think all of you will have something to say about this one.
Yeah, it's a really simple, narrow question there. So no, it's a really interesting one, and yes, I kind of touched on it earlier, but we're seeing some of these things changing, but in most cases they're not going away. So the direction seems to be a bit of, we're not going to impose these things on small and medium businesses, just the biggest ones, and those sorts of things, which is fine, and in the immediate term makes it easier for smaller businesses to not focus on things right away, but it's still going to trickle down because you're still going to be looking at value chains for those big entities, and medium and smaller entities are part of that. So the demands, I think, will come from a different place, but I don't think they're going away. The other thing that we're seeing is that actually many businesses and those big businesses aren't stopping doing stuff, but they might be stopping talking about it. So it's kind of that what's known as green hushing, and because companies are increasingly worried about things like what if we don't meet our targets, what backlash are we going to get? And in some places, I don't want to draw the ire of the political leaders by talking about things in an area that's not what they're interested in. So we've just stopped talking about it. Doesn't mean that those big businesses aren't doing stuff, though, I think. So yeah, that's just a bit of an observation. from me, but
Now,
really keen to hear from others.
I think that's the Air New Zealand factor, right? Where Air New
Yeah.
Zealand has stepped back their climate commitments, but in reality, Air New Zealand are doing quite a lot of things. They are almost stuck in a technology system right now where they're waiting for things to happen, which aren't happening as fast as they'd like from Airbus and Boeing and whoever else is building the future of aircraft. I don't think that's an excuse, though, for those segments where the technology or the solution is already here, and it's more of a oh, it's too hard for me, I won't do it. Like New Zealand has a real reason for making the decision that they did. And I think we keep talking about the excuse of not doing it rather than the opportunity of doing it. And we spoke earlier on around, the fact that we can be a leader in this space as a country, or as an exporter, we can be a leader in this space and move that forward. That other piece I'd say around the reason for it, and again, for any customer on the call who happens to be reliant on natural gas for anything at the moment, you will be forced to move regardless because of the challenge we're having in the natural gas supply. So you might have a contract for 5 years, you might be able to keep winding that back, but MB's numbers are that we've got about 8 years of gas left. And so at some point over the next 8 years, you're going to have to move regardless. It is not a conversation for some of these reasons, for altruistic reasons anymore. It is security of supply, business continuity. And so I think there's some different drivers that are coming to the fore here.
Mm. And it says on cost savings, I mean, there's an element of resources cost money, resources cause emissions. If you can choose different resources, you might have those cost savings. But I think maybe back to Sean's earlier comment around resilience and adaptation, right? Like the cost savings that you're in some of the cost savings that we might be seeing are around that resiliency and taking, that proactive risk resilience there. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're doing something for an efficiency and a sustainability purpose, when I say sustainability, wanting to remain in business in the longer term, like self-sustainability, then these sorts of issues need to be thought through and planned and developed in-house. And when we do that, like a risk mitigation exercise inside a company, annually or whenever periodically, identify those risks and find ways to mitigate them, and then invest in that mitigation action for that risk, that risk management activity, then you're just getting on with being a smart business. You don't have to do a lot of virtue signaling when you do that. And in fact, I think, Belinda's comments about green hushing is a valuable one, because I think that first wave of voluntary action was, a lot of it was focused on virtue signaling and people wanting to kind of, I guess, make a big statement and so forth. But that comes with its own risk, because you draw attention to yourself. And even if you are doing a lot of good stuff, you become a target for people who want to throw mud at your brand. Like, because there's no shortage of brand vandals in the economy who I can't see a good thing when it's in front of them, and also have unrealistic expectations about the pace of change of an entire economy. It's like, if somebody starts to do some recycling for the first time and gets abused by their neighbor for only getting started now, it's like, well, it's not going to be very motivating to carry on and do the next thing. So I think the culture of supporting action is important here. And one of the things that New Zealand's really good at internationally, probably a world leader, is understating things. To not just blow our horn. And I think this is a good approach for New Zealand businesses too, to just quietly get on with it. And rather than go straight for the virtue signaling part of the puzzle. Because if it's virtue signaling is the driver, then the investment is probably going to come out of the marketing budget rather than the business development budget. So let's move the concept away from marketing and making a noise and whatever, and towards making a difference and building that resilience. And then whenever you're asked, oh, by the way, what is your ESG reporting? Well, here it is. You can disclose it where need be, rather than making a big song and dance about it on social media.
Yeah. And I think that's a good shout about remembering that we're all in this imperfect system. We all have to operate within this imperfect system, and shaming someone else because they're at a different point in their journey is not going to help us continue to build that momentum. So we've got a couple questions here that are both around offsets. So I'm going to kind of ask you a broad question here around offsets. So we've seen a number of big companies moving away from climate active over in Australia due to the integrity concerns over the carbon projects, and a few other pieces there. We see there's a sense that businesses are rolling back on carbon neutrality, that maybe offsetting is becoming a reputational risk rather than a benefit. Um, and so, kind of an open question here about where companies who would like to continue to use offsets as a part of their decarbonization strategy, what should they be considering? Is this, are they backing the wrong horse here? What does this look like? And I think everyone's going to have something to say about this. Belinda, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So yes, we watched with interest that sort of media sort of focus on climate active, because they're a program a little bit like us, right?
Indeed.
But there's some key differences. One is that the climate active program has traditionally allowed organisations to become certified by measuring and offsetting without reducing their emissions. So I think increasingly it's just not okay to offset and not reduce. So offsetting can be part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. So that's one difference. And another thing that we've focused really hard on is the integrity of carbon credits and them actually doing what they say they're doing. If you're buying 100 tons of carbon credits, you want there to be 100 tons of reductions or removals of emissions to the atmosphere. So we've always looked at, or been involved with ICROA, International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, for a long time, making sure we're meeting their code of best practice, also looking at other sort of international best practice, things like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and making sure that the carbon credits that are used to make claims in our programs are actually doing what they say on the tin. So those are the sorts of things to be looking at. You want to make sure that it's doing what you think it's doing. You wouldn't be buying anything else that's not actually meeting the requirements of what you're expecting. So why would you with carbon credits? So I'm sure Sean's got a lot to add to that. Maybe throw to you, Sean.
Sure, thanks. I agree with you, Belinda. The country talks about net zero by 2050, and organizations think about net zero. One thing that's really fundamental to understand, and I don't think it's well enough understood in the market, is that net zero is not the same as gross zero. Like if New Zealand was saying we're going to be gross zero by 2050, we're a long way from that. Like, actually, it's impossible, because it's assuming that we are not emitters, or we could avoid being emitters. Now, I'll speak for myself, but I'm an animal, and I'm an obligatory emitter of CO2, and humans are emitters. So it's not about the fact that we're emitters. That's not the problem. It's about the balance with the broader system. And so gross zero most of the time isn't possible. So organizations have the opportunity to measure their footprint, their emissions, reduce it, and even with lots of effort to reduce and lots of cost to reduce, you might be able to achieve a really ambitious outcome of reducing your emissions by 30%, say, across, or 40% across, a 5-year period or more, and maybe even 60%. But you've still got your residual carbon footprint that you can't eliminate for one reason or another. Either it's technologically impossible, or it's prohibitively expensive. And so measuring and reducing and not offsetting is always an option, but you won't get to net zero by that. So net zero, and you won't get to gross zero either. So the next question is, should we just measure and reduce and not offset? And if that became the global trend, then a whole lot of money that would go towards additional projects that are causing emission reductions and carbon sequestration and climate resilience wouldn't happen. Globally, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, all of the science academies around the world know that the offsetting piece, or what we call offsetting, is fundamental to the global goal that we're trying to get to and avoid 1.5 degree warming, or avoid anything more than that. So I think there's a knee-jerk reaction to publicity from brand vandals who have attacked the carbon market quite successfully, I'm saddened that there hasn't been a strong enough counter argument in the media among industry actors, including organisations like our own, like Toitū. We're a carbon management provider and a certifier, and we're aligned with ICROA as well, and have been for many years. And the integrity of the offsets is really, really important. In fact, our brand is focused very much on top shelf single malt carbon credits, so that when people get to the offsetting piece, they're causing some seriously good shit to happen in their neighborhood, right? So like, let's fix, fix our nation. Well, this is one way to do that in a voluntary way. So more of a conversation needs to happen around the appropriate forms of offsetting. And offsetting is not a get out of jail free card. It's not cheating, right? Because it's not illegal to emit carbon, right? So there's quite a big narrative, I think, that still needs to happen. But fundamentally, high integrity offsetting is what's needed. Another part of this, which I'll just add, is that measuring your emissions and then pricing your emissions is really important, in my humble opinion, because if you're not properly pricing those emissions, when it comes to buying your offsets, you might buy offsets that are really low cost and maybe they're not really high integrity, right? Whereas if you're pricing your emissions appropriately, and how would you do that? Well, let's price them at the social cost of those emissions, which Treasury has worked out is the social cost of carbon in New Zealand, their recommended emissions values. And if we priced our emissions according to the social cost of them, then when it comes to buying our offsets, we will buy higher quality offsets because they're more expensive. And so this is one of the ways in which the voluntary carbon market globally, I believe, needs an upgrade, not just on the quality of the offsets and the projects they're coming from, but also the pricing of those offsets, so that there's not these really low cost options in the market.
Nice. All right. So keep reducing. Offsetting is not the only mechanism, but offsetting is an important piece in the puzzle. There's funding, there's a lot of co-benefits here, and it's going to be necessary to help cover those hard to abate, hard to reduce spaces. Amazing. We probably have time for maybe like one more question. We're going to take Kath's here from Good Sense. So Kath has asked, how well do you think medium and smaller businesses in general in Aotearoa are aware of and understand the multiple risks that they face from inaction? So looking at those smaller end. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky for small businesses because, they don't have a person that's focused on sustainability or those sorts of things. You typically have a person that's wearing many, many hats. And when the economy's tight, you're really focusing on, survival or, making the most of that real short-term opportunity. So I think it is tricky for small and medium businesses. Some are looking at this stuff, but I think there's definitely space for just taking a little bit of time, if you can, to be sort of thinking long term, doing some future thinking in the climate space, but also in other risk areas. So, because otherwise you might survive for this year, but next year something hits you that you're just not expecting. So, yeah, I think there's probably a wide range of level of understanding, but I think it is a bit tricky.
I think there's different reasons why businesses jump on to, I'm going to call it the sustainability bandwagon in the nicest possible way, of which I am on. But you have, that's the right thing to do. And so again, those are the businesses where they might be a bit challenged right now, where they want to go and make that investment, because that's what they feel it's a really important place to play. There are those who are doing it for business reasons. And I guess there's two different business reasons for me. One is access to markets. So showing you've got some certification to enable you to go and win a contract or whatever that might be. Or it's setting yourself up for efficiency and reducing costs inside your business. And so I think for especially those last two reasons, if that's the reason why your business is involved in doing sustainability, then you are exactly the right candidate for it. You should be doing far more, because that'll open more opportunities for you in a tight market. If you're doing it for it's the nice reason to do it, I guess you've got to reflect back and say, is that the only reason? Has it actually enabled me to do anything differently? Has it enabled different conversations for that I can unlock? So I guess there's that piece. So maybe a bit of reflection on why you're there. But I guess for me, engaging with businesses in a particular area right now, and I've labored on about the energy market, energy is an input to every business in the country. And I'm constantly surprised that no one has a perspective on the forward risk we have of both electricity and fossil fuel supply. To your point, Belinda, I think people have got too much going on in their heads and they're focused too much on the balance sheet. Pull yourself back, look out there, look at the risk, look at the opportunity, and jump.
I'll just add a quick point because I know we're running out of time.
Okay.
Another good reason to look at emission reductions is when you measure your carbon footprint, you can identify where your emissions are coming from. You can then identify which of those emission reduction opportunities can be delivered at negative cost. So here's an example. I'll do that, and I'll do this. So that didn't cost me anything, and it's actually it's reducing my electricity bills. So if you look at across your business and see, and if you understand where your emissions are, so do the measurement piece, then figure out, okay, which emission reductions are going to be cost negative for us. So do them, and then you're saving money and looking after the climate system. And then you can look at, after that, which emissions are cost positive, but where there's going to be a return on investment through energy efficiency investments that cost money now, but are going to save you money in the future. And if you do that just in a normal cycle of infrastructure renewal, then next time you buy an office fridge, just get the most energy efficient one. It's probably going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's going to, it's going to be lower operating costs going forward, etc., etc.
That's really great. So we've covered a huge amount of information today. I think the message that I'm hearing from your wonderful brains is that this is still no regrets. Keep going, even in economic downturn, even with, maybe inconsistent or changing policies. The writing's on the wall. You do want to keep going. Take any steps that you can. And so some of that is around looking at, measuring what you can so that you can make some informed choices, including looking at your risks and what your risk profile might be there in case that helps inform what you can do now. Really, there was a lot of good themes today around thinking differently. Don't try and solve this with the status quo. Let's use this as an opportunity to think really differently. Remembering that finance can play both roles. So you can, there's negative cost options. There's looking at, the CapEx, OpEx balance sheets here, thinking about the investment strategies that you might be able to get and investment, not just with classic investment. Huge range of information here. It's clearly, though, we should keep going. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and spending some of your morning with us. We have recorded today's session, and you will all receive a copy of this in the coming days. I don't want to speak for all of our panelists, but I know that if you have further questions, please reach out. We're always happy to hear those questions and answer as best we can. And I think we also want to do more of these. There was such a great interest. It was wonderful to have everyone here. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. It's been really great to hear what you had to say today. Thank you, everyone. Ka kite.